Indigenous education is a huge part of teaching in the modern age. The students occupying classrooms today are more diverse than ever, and as the facilitators of education, teachers must be able to utilize a variety of tools, teaching strategies, and resources in the classroom in order to reach a larger audience. In a K-6 setting, Indigenous education is crucial to building values of respect and appreciation of Indigenous culture, which Indigenous Australians have lived by since before European settlement. Teachers have the monumental task of planting the seed which will grow into values of respect for others, regardless of background or culture. Indigenous education in a primary setting is essential when teaching both values of equality and learning about the identity of the country in which we live in. In the classroom, it is crucial for educators to avoid discrimination and hold a universal standard for learning and assessment for the entire class. According to the Melbourne Declaration on Educational Goals for Young People, educational outcomes for young Indigenous Australians is substantially behind other students in key areas from attendance to literacy and numeracy. It is of the utmost importance that all students are given equal ground in which to participate and achieve in learning outcomes. In the current state of education, statistics are showing that Indigenous students are behind their non-Indigenous classmates. The Creative Spirits website shows that 60% of Indigenous students are behind by the end of early stage 1. This creates an alarming trend as Indigenous students progress throughout primary education. If students are being left behind at this early level of education, they are far less prepared for the progression into high school education, which leads to higher high school leaving rates. This prompts teachers to look at Indigenous education pedagogy and teaching strategies in order to better prepare Indigenous students for the learning road ahead. Indigenous history is extremely interesting and reaches to every area of the K-6 syllabus. Topics such as the Rainbow Serpent, Dreamtime stories, colonization, and the Stolen Generation are major parts of our country's history, and students must view Indigenous history as equally important as European history. The arts can focus on the concept of origins and dreaming stories, depicting stories through imagery, drama, dance, and music. Indigenous history can become a multifaceted unit incorporating mathematics, English, arts, and PDHPE. These different concepts all melt together to form an overview of an Indigenous culture throughout history. An example of a lesson for a Stage 2 class could involve arts and English. The students look at 2 sample Dreamtime stories and use those as inspiration to create their own Dreamtime stories. Individuals must then choose an art form to illustrate their Dreamtime stories. Although the lesson is simple, it prompts students to look at Indigenous culture and think, what would you do if you were a part of the Indigenous culture? This prompts students to look at not only Indigenous stories, but look at how Indigenous Australians view the land, what it means to them as a culture. Although Indigenous education is heavily rooted into Australian history, some teachers may feel they are unfit to teach Indigenous culture to their class. This poses a problem as it would leave a significant hole in Australian history. It must be possible for students to educate themselves in Indigenous culture in order to pass that knowledge on to their students. While it is possible for a teacher to outsource Indigenous education to an expert, but if an expert isn't readily available, then a crucial component of history remains untaught. Each state or territory has an Aboriginal Education Advisory Council for teachers to utilise. A New South Wales-based organisation, which is maintained by volunteers, offers training in Aboriginal education in order to increase educational outcomes for all Indigenous students, as well as raise the outcomes for all teaching and training. This is an outlet for teachers to reach out and receive training in order to better their teaching skills in Indigenous education. Towns also have cultural centres located in residential areas. These centres allow for learning about the local culture as well as a refuge for local youths. Visiting a cultural centre will allow a new teacher not only to gain an insight into the local Indigenous culture, but also to get to know the region around them. A cultural centre may be a place in which a teacher can become acquainted with the area in which they will be teaching in. This would be a great place for a teacher to visit if they were to begin teaching in a new area. When we look at Indigenous culture, we'll look at stories of the Dreamtime, learning from the land, cave paintings, and ancient traditions passed down from generation to generation. It is only natural to add an Indigenous culture component to the creative arts syllabus. This allows students to begin to experience what art was like within the Indigenous culture and understand the importance of art within the culture itself. Indigenous culture can be represented in dot paintings, native dances, the acting of Dreamtime stories, Indigenous music, and more. This spreads to other areas of the primary curriculum. The stories of the Dreamtime can be linked to an English unit of work, allowing for students to compose their own Dreamtime stories about the land. It is essential to emphasize the importance of art in the Indigenous culture. It was used to tell stories, perform rituals, entertainment, and to pass information down to the younger generation. To Indigenous Australians, the art was essential to continuing their traditions and assuring the younger generation would have enough information to pass it down to younger generations. When looking at Indigenous culture, Indigenous people's pride is a massive component in the classroom. Although the teacher has high expectations of students, this does not mean that Indigenous students will attempt to reach those standards. According to Neil Harrison, Indigenous students may feel out of place in the classroom. A substantial part of maintaining this identity is hiding their fear and vulnerability by acting unenthusiastic and uninterested in the classroom. This persona is often adopted to avoid feeling shamed in front of their peers if they do not score well. This fear of shame often results in Indigenous students not attempting set work if they don't already know the answer. Chris Sara, director of the Stronger Smarter Institute, believes that holding low expectations of Indigenous students is hindering their learning rather than helping close the gap. He continues to say that holding high expectations will always bring better results due to students expanding their knowledge rather than remaining academically stagnant. A teacher must build a strong rapport with their students, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, in order to instill values that all answers are welcome and there are nothing wrong with a wrong answer. Building strong relationships with students is key in building towards all students reaching higher expectations. When teaching creative arts from an Indigenous perspective, the teacher must show the utmost respect to the Indigenous culture and its people. Respect is at the forefront of priorities when teaching Indigenous subject matter. Teachers must actively research the subject matter they are going to be teaching and respect the rights of the original owner of the targeted resource. Educators must make sure that none of the original owner's rights are being infringed upon by displaying their work in a classroom setting. When we look at the arts, we always look towards a practical approach to teaching, building skill by participation. This allows the student to perform the skills necessary to complete the exercise and perform changes to further build on those skills. At the end of the lesson, the students have a finished product in which they can look back on. Creative arts is also a subject where the students are able to be vocal and collaborate with each other, which suits the learning style of most primary-age children. The students being able to collaborate with their classmates and teacher promotes inclusivity in the classroom. Excursions to Indigenous historical sites give students a hands-on view of Indigenous arts that have been preserved throughout history. Seeing an Indigenous rock carving in the world opposed to seeing a photo in the classroom provides more excitement and intrigue. With the help of a guide, if possible, the students would be able to learn about the historical significance of the area and see how the use of art was a large part of the Indigenous culture. An excursion to the Blue Mountains Three Sisters is a popular destination for an excursion. Linking the location to an Indigenous story allows the students to see an Indigenous legend come alive. Visiting a local museum showing local Indigenous artwork is a beneficial experience in terms of the appreciation of artwork. The visit allows students to view a variety of artworks and build their interpretations of what and why. This also promotes an Indigenous perspective from a local standpoint. Looking at an artwork and having the ability to point out local landmarks or events allows the students to explore their local history throughout the arts. What could be more effective than learning from an expert, an individual who uses these skills in their lives, an Indigenous elder? The Indigenous elders would know the most about the arts and Indigenous culture and would be able to incorporate strategies used by their elders in order to educate a new audience. The inclusion of instruction from an Indigenous elder adds a level of authenticity to the lesson. This also gives the teacher an option if they feel they are inept at teaching Indigenous arts. The problem with relying on an Indigenous elder is that they may be reluctant to accept your invitation. Neil Harrison explains that Indigenous elders may feel uncomfortable in the classroom setting or with your role as a teacher. It is important for a teacher to spend time with Indigenous elders, getting to know them before requesting a guest appearance to the school. Most schools will have an interactive whiteboard installed within the classroom. This provides an invaluable resource within teaching. The ability to access web pages for the class to view as well as create interactive activities for the students to participate in can become a major part of classroom learning. In the context of creative arts, the interactive whiteboard can be used to teach the appreciation component of creative arts. For example, a famous Indigenous artwork may be displayed on the whiteboard, and the students must look at the art and answer what techniques are used. What does the image represent, and how does that make you feel? NAIDOC Week is a celebration of Indigenous Australian history and culture in July every year. NAIDOC Week is an excellent time to plan an Indigenous Culture Appreciation Day to celebrate and support the local Indigenous community. An Indigenous Appreciation Day allows the entire school to fully appreciate Indigenous culture. Students are broken up into groups and experience a round of activities hosted by fellow teachers and community volunteers. This day can allow students to experience many aspects of Indigenous culture, like food, music, dancing, arts, games, and much more. This provides a fun day that provides awareness and appreciation for Indigenous culture. The community is the biggest resource a teacher could have. The community is the history of the area, and collectively will be able to assist the teaching of customs and traditions of the area. This is why it is crucial for a teacher to become a part of the community in which their school is based in. Teachers must always be working to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. The longer the gap remains wide, the less chance for equality we have. A combination of effective teaching strategies and building relationships with the students and community will provide a safe and productive environment for all students. The values of respect and equality for all students should echo throughout a school, providing an inclusive environment for all students to learn.